Hi, this is Steve Worona, and you're listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Before I introduce today's speaker, here's a brief orientation to the Adobe Connect interface we're using. Your browser right now is showing the title slide for today's talk. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a box labeled Questions and Comments where you can read and type messages. There's a tab labeled Everyone at the bottom of this box, and that's the tab you use for all of your general messages, including questions and comments for our speaker. We'll be breaking for questions several times during the presentation, so please do not hold your questions to the end. You can also send direct messages to a specific person by hovering your cursor over a name in the attendee list. And one of those names is Dwight DeCoster, NCCPS, and that's the place to go if you run into technical problems. We're also monitoring Twitter for your questions and comments. Use hashtag NCCPSwebinar. If you miss part of today's conversation, or if you want to see some or all of it again, this webinar is being recorded. The link will be available shortly after the webinar on the NCCPS Webinars webpage. And watch your email for a link to a brief evaluation survey requesting your reactions and comments on today's presentation. Please take a minute to respond to that survey when the link arrives. We do appreciate your feedback, and sorry once again for the premature mailing of that survey request this morning. You'll get another one during the webinar. And now for today's presentation. If your campus all-hazards emergency response plan doesn't cover international incidents, you're missing a crucial element. With faculty-led and independent study abroad programs, academic research, athletics, and general university travelers, offshore emergencies can arise at any time. Successfully dealing with international incidents requires careful advanced planning, and today we'll be hearing from an expert practitioner. We're welcoming Pascal Schuback, former Global Emergency Manager for the University of Washington. During his 3.5 years at UW, his responsibilities included the security and safety of all international travel for the campus community and the development of tools to support situational awareness, continuity, and response to global incidents. Pascal has worked in the emergency management field for over 16 years in public, private, and academic environments, working on the development of resources to support global academic institutions and travelers. He supports the Disaster Resilient Universities Network and Pulse International, a dedicated group of full-time international health, safety, and security managers for institutions of higher education. And Pascal is also a director with the Humanitarian Toolbox, a sustained effort to leverage technology and skilled volunteer communities. Pascal Schuback, welcome to Campus Public Safety Online.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Appreciate being here. And first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming back. My apologies for having to cancel the January session such in a quick hurry, but unfortunately, Mother Nature and I had a disagreement, and I had an injury that required me not to be able to do anything for a couple weeks. So I'm glad to be healthy and back and being able to make up for this. So starting today, one of the things that I wanted to do is establish some baselines for everyone to know and go through, because we all live in diverse communities. Some of our institutions are in the tens of thousands of students, and some of them are in the 5 to less thousands of students, and in the faculty and staff, and some have research facilities, some have medical facilities, and the such. So what I wanted to talk about today is who is our traveler? And Steve started defining that a little bit in the intro, and so I wanted to make sure I add to that and make sure everyone understands and knows those differences. Most of the time when we talk about international incidences and international travelers, it's always referred to the days of when we were all young and we were study abroad students, if you did happen to go on a study abroad program. Unfortunately, now in times, we have a lot more incidents that are taking place that are not related to study abroad. And so our international travelers are more than just study abroad students. We have more international athletic activities. The University of Washington just recently sent to China their basketball team and was able to play overseas in China. Great opportunity, but at the same time, they're international traveling, and therefore incidences could take place, and protocols that are normally established for those programs might not exist once you start leaving the borders of our country. Research, conferences, presentations, those are continuously growing, and with the advancement of airplanes and the ability to go on nonstop flights, it's far reachable for us to get to places faster and quicker for quick 2-3 day conferences, and our mindset's changed to that ability of like, hey, I'm just flying to Denver for the weekend and coming back. Instead, I'm flying to another country and then flying back in the next 3 days. Nothing could happen to me, yet alone things do happen. And then, of course, we have all our institutions willing to increase our business and our recruitment and our advancement opportunities. So international activity is a highly regarded place to work in and to expand and grow to. And then one area that's starting to grow, that's always been there, but it's just becoming more and more of a challenge, is student organizations. And I'm sure some of you who are some of my colleagues and friends are all cringing at my discussion mentioning this, but it is a challenge that we have to think about and prepare for because they're always in that gray area depending on our policies. But student organizations are like groups that come together that are authorized and can do activities on campus, but they're not necessarily officially campus groups that are funded by the university. They're just recognized by the university. So how does that fit? Those are important things to think about. We may not go too much into that, but those are things you definitely want to think about as a traveler upon your university travel program. So as we keep going forward, as we understand those, now thinking about you as institutions, I know I was able to read through quickly this morning some of the attendees today, and I see some of my former colleagues and good friends, and I appreciate you being here and supporting me, and hopefully you'll get just as much out of this as those who may not have ever heard of me or they may not have an emergency international response plan on your campus. So that's what we want to help and advance today. Some plans are there probably, but at the same time they're not necessarily focused on international activity. Again, some universities or programs might not have any sort of plans, and so hopefully you'll get some there. And then some of you might even have an employee who has a duty as assigned, where it's kind of that 0.5 FTE, oh yeah, you take care of that problem, because someone needs to, and we don't really understand what's needed, but it needs to have a definition. And then there are those out there who I know some of you are on the phone are the dedicated international full-time travel health and safety persons. Most of them that I know are all part of the Pulse International Group, which is a group of organized international travel safety and health personnel who get together from all the different universities that have them and continuously work together through challenges and be able to help build and raise awareness to what we do. And so I enjoy being a part of that group and helping them any way I can. And those are some important things to know about and to understand as we keep moving forward today. So now let's get into a little bit more about comprehensive emergency management plans. And some of you might have knowledge about this. Some of you might have written the emergency management plan, and some of you might be very new to it. And so I want to make sure we go through some of the basics of what that emergency management plan is and could do to support you. The comprehensive emergency management plan, which I'm going to try and abbreviate to CEMP, because I tend to talk fast and I need to remind myself of that, but also saying comprehensive emergency management plan tongue twists me. So we'll just refer to the CEMP. And it's a written plan that helps us be able to identify and address issues that we know that could take place, either natural or man-made emergencies or disasters, which we know we're capable to have. So for example, in the Northwest, all of our comprehensive management plans mention the word earthquakes, and we prepare for that no-notice event that could take place at any time that we need to be aware of. Now personally, being from the Northwest, I would love to include major snowstorms, but I know my colleagues on the East Coast, that's a lot in their emergency management plans because you guys do get a lot more snow than we do, and you need to be prepared for that, and it causes those types of emergencies. It also helps specify the purpose and the organization of the responsibilities, both internally and externally, because our institutions are all very different. The University of Washington, which I refer to often a lot, having worked there, is in the downtown core of a very large community, and so it doesn't have its own fire department. It has its own police department, but it has different organizational structures that are needed both internally to the university and externally to the university that need to be identified. Whereas I know some academic institutions have a fire department, which is really cool, but they also have their police and fire and health and everything else because they're much more isolated and need that resource to support them. So that's where the CEMP helps to identify all those to understand who's going to do what, when they're going to do what, and how they're going to do it. What's really nice about the CEMP, and which I really try and look at as the value for what we're going to talk about today, is the CEMPs are supported and signed off by the organization's executive leadership, meaning it's the university president or provost. And so therefore, it's getting authorized. It's getting visual time in front of the president and the provost. It's getting reviewed by attorneys. Sometimes that delays the process of signing it, but it is a document that's there, and there's a process for us to be able to get it and set it up. And so that's an important step for us today, because some of our international activities and our response plans are small, not really that popular, or not really that noticeable until something happens. But having that executive sign-off is important to be able to sustain it and help it grow. And so how can we use the CEMP to our advantage, but also help unify the process is what we'll talk about today. So design elements of the CEMP are things that we will kind of go into a little bit in details, but how we can incorporate those into adding an international emergency plan or annex to it. And so the CEMPs are built on the conduct of community-based. Now I think the word community is not like you think at home in your neighborhood and bringing the neighborhood together, but the community within our institutions. The insides of institutions are its own community. They have its own challenges and own dynamics. And as I mentioned earlier, it's both internal and external organizations. So the CEMP is mostly a community within the university and brings everyone together, and it brings that understanding of how we can plan and work together. So there's a process already in place for us to work through response plans and work through the steps that are needed. That's a great advantage. It also ensures the plans are developed through the analysis of risk. People are coming together and identifying. You might, in your organizations or on your campuses, you might have the ability to hire a contractor to do a threat assessment, or you might have the state, if your state institution, include the threat assessment of your university inside a state contract. And so there's already resources there that are available. What just might need to be done is inside of an RFP is adding the section of international threats, international risk, international threat assessment, so that you can bank off of what's already being done and just add that portion, and I say little, to the bigger process. But that's a great key to it. Identifying operational assumptions and resource demands just helps you identify the challenges. As being one of the only global emergency managers on campus, sometimes it was very lonely because you were the only one doing the professional duties. And that was the value of the Pulse group, is we had the ability to reach out to others and go, I'm in this type of situation, what do you guys do? And reach out to colleagues in the same situation. But instead, this allows you to expand that capability so that you have more people understanding what you do for a response, understanding the needs and the challenges. And I always referred back to this, and you'll hear me say it a couple times, is the 3-day weekend. Things always happen on that 3-day weekend. At the same time, also the elements prioritize plans and planning efforts to support it. This is something where you might have to push a little bit and make sure you mention the importance of international events compared to an earthquake. Obviously, your university or academic institution needs to plan accordingly and prioritize its projects, but helping push to get international in there up on top of the list could help you prepare and respond much faster in getting this set up. And then at the same time, it integrates and synchronizes efforts across all levels of the government and the organization. And I'll refer to an incident that happened in Seattle a couple months ago in the fall, where we had a tour bus with a bunch of international students get hit by another tour vehicle on top of a bridge. We had some deaths and a lot of international students injured. And that was a starting point for our region to understand, wow, we have a lot of international people. We have a lot of international complexities that they did not realize in the city's emergency management plan. The incident didn't involve any University of Washington students, but involved another academic institution in our community, and we're very supportive of that. And that's something that we need to think about, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So what do you already have? So hopefully all of you can raise your hand virtually, and I can see all of them, that all of you do have a CEMP. And let's hope you have that. If you don't, happy to help with that, but that's something you should really focus on and get moving forward. And then adding that international aspect is a great timing effect for that. But the CEMP is a document that helps us move forward faster than we've had in the past, being able to do it yourself. If you're a one-man shop or a two-person office, it's hard to get all the things done that need to get done. So how can we piggyback on the same types of processes to help us move forward? And that's what the CEMP is. It's a document that already tells us how to respond to incidences. All we have to do now is add that international flavor to it. It's a mechanism that helps us bring people together. That's a challenge in itself, because it's hard to get everyone together with all the time, schedules, and everything else. It's hard to get people to train and exercise. I'm sure all of you would love to get 10 hours a week or 10 hours a month at least to help people train and exercise on this, but unfortunately we probably only get 10 hours a year. So by unifying us together with this document and international activities, we can increase that capacity. It also helps us define what is an emergency, because I'm sure even on the phone call all the participants today, we could have a long discussion on defining what is an emergency. So for our institutions, the CEMP helps us to identify that. So let's include the international part to it. How to declare an emergency and identification of what policies can be bypassed. So being a former county, state, federal person, and then working in an academic institution, as most of us who have that experience know, that emergency operations and emergency management plans are there to help us. And when we declare an emergency, some rules get taken out of the picture so that we can move faster and move things along. That's a great opportunity for us in the event of an incident, is knowing that there's policies in place that help us overcome those challenges, so that during that 3-day weekend, just like we had, if any of us had an emergency and we needed certain resources, we can bypass some of those steps, because in an emergency that's declared, these policies take place. So let's, again, you add that international flair to it, and that support can be there and helpful during times of crisis on an international incident without having to do too much extra work. But we'll go through that. So where do international incidents fit into the CEMP? Some of you, the CEMPs can be 20, 30-page documents. For others, it could be 150, 200-page document, because it goes into those details, and depending on the number of campuses you have, the number of types of campuses, medical facilities, research, laboratories, all those things add up, and so it expands the document. What I recommend is it has its own annex, and it has its own ability to shape and develop its own self, but at the same time also has key points dropped into the main comprehensive emergency management plan throughout the document. And some of those areas would include like the crisis communications area. The crisis communications probably already has their own annex and section, and therefore they have their whole structure. But crisis communications is a very big part in international response, because that's mostly the way things are communicated, because it's never really on campus. But having them identify the international perspectives that are needed is important. And it's important for us to be able to make sure we have that in advance. I'm sure a lot of you had a very interesting night in November when the Paris attack started, and more questions coming out and needed for answers. How do you work with your crisis communication team is important to do in advance and document that. Like I mentioned earlier, the process of procurement. I had a great example to give to you. In South Africa, we had a faculty-led program. It was during the time when Home Depot had their fraudulent activity. The banking company that manages Home Depots decided to shut down all activity with South Africa, which included our bank cards that our faculty-led program directors had to pay for food, gas, lodging, everything else for the 20-some students that were on this program. That became an emergency for the campus. And of course, it happened on a 3-day weekend where we could not get access to the funds, so we had to find alternative ways to do this to support those students, to make sure they got home, make sure they got to their food, and they got gas in their vehicles. So those type of things are important to understand, and that's where you put it inside the segment that talks about procurement. At the same time, public health emergencies. Those are critical. Those actually happen in both directions. For students wanting to go to a country, or researchers wanting to go to a country and study, or students or faculty, researchers, others who are in another country coming back to the U.S. and bringing something back. Those are some things that your communicable disease committee needs to really think about and work together on an international basis to understand which way it goes. At the University of Washington during the Ebola crisis, we had to bring people home because we were concerned about their health and safety for Ebola. But at the same time, we had researchers, doctors, nurses, and others who wanted to go to help provide the aid and do the research. So how do you manage that? And that's where documenting this in advance in an annex, but also within public health side of things helps in keeping those things consistent. So the international travel annex, like I mentioned, is its own world. And by separating it out, keeps the ability for you to have it be written in a way that supports your international activities. You might have different campus groups. You might have a study abroad office. You might have an international graduate office. You might have international student services offices. And you want to work those together, and that already there is enough complexity to make an annex complex. Incorporating that completely into the CEMP is even more challenging. So therefore, building your own annex helps identify the resources and the differences between those on an on-campus international-based response, such as the response levels. Like I said, small little credit card issue is not a campus-based emergency. It does not need a full EOC activation. It does not need a lot of those type of responses that you would have, but it's still a pretty critical emergency. It could become a huge crisis communication problem because a quick tweet from a student saying, breaking news, University of Washington not giving us money, can get hit by the media and then questioned. But at the same time, it's an important one because it requires the support of procurement. It requires the support of offices to be able to bypass rules. And those are things that are important. Roles during an international incident. This is a very important thing I'll talk more about later as well. But who's in charge of what on an international incident versus a campus-based incident? Especially if you're unifying your teams in response, it's important to make sure you identify those type of roles and responsibilities. At the same time, the decision-making authority. Obviously, the decision always lies at the top with the president or provost, but how do we make sure that authority is lined out and drawn out? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit too. Policies. This is something I won't talk too much about in the actual policies of each type, but policies are important to pre-identify in advance. One of them that's very challenging to do, that you take some time to work through, is how do you remove a traveler or allowing travelers to enter countries? Do you allow travelers to go to Afghanistan? Do you allow travelers to go to Mogadishu? How do you remove a traveler or a student who's on a program that's doing inappropriate activity? Can you really tell a student to come home in a country that they're by themselves doing their own study abroad program that's becoming dangerous? You can't tell them to forcibly get on an airplane. So how do you work through those challenges? Those are policies that should be identified in advance, but they could be identified inside your CMP, which also helps you identify with your president and your provost executives of signing off, going, this is how these steps are going to take, and that's how it's going to work. I mentioned crisis communications, and then also the International Travel Oversight Committee I'll talk about. But before I get to that, I think we're going to break for a couple questions.
Thanks, Pascal. You are listening to Campus Public Safety Online, and today's topic is adding international incidents to your campus all-hazards emergency response plans. We're talking to Pascal Schuback, who's in Seattle, Washington. Type your questions into the chat area. We will get to them at a couple of breaks that we have planned. Pascal, John Summerlot wonders, is there any estimate on how many universities have a person specifically dedicated to international emergency management?
Hey, John, that's a great question, actually. And the Pulse group, we've been trying to identify that, and it's always fun. We've identified about 60 institutions that have full-time people, but at the same time, that definition is kind of challenging as well, because some institutions define it as this is your full-time role just in this area of saying students on study abroad programs versus students, active faculty, research is as a whole in charge of, but as well as working through those definitions, but we've pretty much identified about 65, and almost every other week we identify someone else new who doesn't know about the program or the group or that we exist, and so it expands slowly. I can tell you 4 years ago, I think it was about 12 to 15 people in the Pulse group, and it's expanded to about 65 now, so it's gone pretty quick.
Carl Finney wonders, and I suspect a number of other people are wondering the same thing, how can we get added to the Pulse group?
So that's a great question. If you are a full-time travel and health and safety person assigned to do global health and safety, you're welcome to send me an email, and I can reach out to the group. And there's a welcoming committee, and they'll go through the process and identify that and work with you on getting onto the group.
I'm going to squeeze in 2 more questions in this break, even though we are falling a bit behind our timeline. How should Clery statistics gathering and reporting factor into the CEMP?
So that's a great process. I mean, if you think of Clery, Clery reports campus-based things, right? So why not just add an international button on that? But at the same time, it, by your institution, needs to define what is international and are you there? There's a good discussion right now that the NCCPS is working with, as well as other organizations, on really what is the requirement for Clery overseas. And that's something that your own institution, Attorney General's office and legal team needs to actually identify and define, because there's no set standard. The federal government's very good at that. There's a gray area on how you need to define that. Personally, I think it's important just to document that there were incidences, one for Clery and those type of legal issues, but also to identify, are you providing enough pre-travel information and support before the incident to help educate your travelers and be able to then reduce those incidences. That to me is an important number. For the clery side of it's important to document those things, but again, it's a legal issue that your own departments and academic institutions should define. But to me, I look at it as just adding an international part to it. The only difference is the location.
Should your off-campus programs director be a part of an executive safety committee?
So your offshore programs director. So if you have locations around the world where you actually have a full-time employee, absolutely, they should be a part of a safety committee. Now, does that mean they need to be part of the campus-based safety committee? Like, it's challenging when you deal with 12-hour time zones and different work schedules and getting everyone to meet. But you could create a subgroup committee or a subcommittee that focuses on all the international safety, all the international locations and safety officers, and creating that capability. And maybe that's just a mailing list that all of you converse on and you meet bi-monthly. But it's a good thing to have because it helps you disseminate the information that you're working on preparedness and response to the people who are going to be dealing with it firsthand. So as a good example, and I use this on a police department kind of example, if you have an officer on the street and your captain's on the safety committee, your captain should be sharing to the officer what's needed. That's just like in the international perspective. If you have an international officer on campus and you have international people overseas, that information should be shared so that the person on the ground dealing with the problem is aware of what's going on, how the institution wants to respond, what are the pre-planned aspects of responding, and what's going to happen. Because that's going to help reduce a lot of complexity, and that's a good practice to do.
Okay, thanks, Pascal. Keep those questions coming in. We will not lose track of them, and Pascal has agreed to provide answers to any that we can't quite get to during the hour. But in the meantime, Pascal, I'll let you get back to your presentation. That's slide 10.
Great, thanks. So one of the areas that's important, and I quickly mentioned it before the questions, is an International Travel Oversight Committee. And this is kind of different than what we just talked about, a safety committee. So a safety committee talks about actual, this is how it's going to happen, or we know there's this type of hazard. And some of that information from a safety committee can expand and grow and be pushed up to an International Travel Oversight Committee. But the Oversight Committee is really more the key players on campus that deal with the policies and the structures. And they're there to help advise and be the subject matter experts or provide subject matter experts to the executive level, so to the president and the provost. And that's an important thing to have because, for example, that challenge that I had mentioned earlier about how do you remove a student or a traveler from a program or an area, that's challenging. In the private institutions, it's simple. You're going to get fired if you don't come home. Most of the time, people will get on an airplane, come home, and that's over with. But with the freedoms inside the academic institutions of travelers and also dealing with students, it's a little bit more challenging to that. So policies have to be made and procedures, and therefore a Travel Oversight Committee is the group that can help start that process and make sure that those steps are documented and organized and agreed upon, which then gets filtered into the CEMP. And so inside a CEMP, you can document in your annex that you have a Travel Oversight Committee. You can identify their roles and responsibility, but then also you need to make sure that you understand, and my personal opinion on this is they are not the decision makers, because the CEMP goes quickly and should identify that the executive of the institution, the president and provost, are the ones that have the final decisions. And that's why the value of using a CEMP is the president and provost are trained, when they are trained, to do it in that process. So instead of adding another complex step and process of a different way of dealing with what's called an emergency, which in the president and provost's mind, emergency means we follow this process. Let's incorporate the both campus and international into the same process that our executives are trained to do. So the International Travel Oversight Committee becomes that executive advisory panel or policy group for international incidences. But they're definitely not there to make the actual decision. They might come up with the recommendation for a certain decision, but they're not quite there. So I'm sure one of the questions that's probably being typed already right now is who's on this committee? And this is where it comes in, and I just listed out some of the basics and I think that are most required to have on there, but obviously your institution might call them differently. So first of all, if you have a senior international officer, whoever's that designated person should be the chair of that committee designated by the president and the provost. So this is a very executive level committee, but it's chaired by someone, and that should be that senior international officer. The dean or vice president of student life, whoever that person is on top, should also be a part of this committee. And all of these positions should be the director level or executive level for those departments, but they could be assigned to others, to a deputy director or an associate director, however those titles work. But one thing that's important, and I stress this a lot, is whoever is on this committee needs to have the ability to have executive authority decision making. So that way decisions can be made during the meetings and can be actionable and then move forward. So we can move things along. Otherwise, it gets lost in that committee process of going back, coming back, someone's on vacation, it's summer, going back, coming back. Do we ever actually officialize the process? So that's what I would recommend for that process inside of a committee. Other people here that are important is, if you have a global health department or a school of medicine, getting those people some representation from that, because they have a dynamic that's different than what maybe students would do for undergraduate or even just graduate students. Faculty and student representation is important. Student representation might be less important, but faculty is really important because these policies can affect faculty members and how they do business and how they operate. So response levels. 3 basic questions that I put in here that are important is, what type of incident is taking place? What is the institution's risk tolerance? So some institutions are very risk tolerant and some are not, and that will change the way the response works. And what is the intensity of the incident? Like I said earlier, a credit card incident, shutdown is a small problem. But when there's 26 students relying upon that credit card, that becomes a much more intense problem to deal with. But at the same time, what type of incident is taking place? Terrorist event in Paris? Maybe your students are not involved because you've been able to figure out that everyone's accounted for it and no one was involved. But on the crisis communications and post-incident details of what is your response process? What is the information that is requested by the media? Those things can change your response drastically. So one of the things that, at the same time that's important is, did I just skip one? No, sorry. Is understanding the roles during that incident on how to respond. Who does what, how, when do they do it? And that advantage of having it all incorporated into the CEMP, again, is that it's identified in advance and brought attention before the incident happens. So that way at 4 o'clock in the morning on Saturday of a 3-day weekend, you can come to the EOC if it's a major incident and everyone knows, or you can get on your virtual conference call line and everyone already knows kind of how this is going to play. And this is something that's really important because it can cause controversies and it can cause challenges in the future of how to deal and respond with things. So setting this up in advance is important. And again, having the international annex to inside the CEMP helps with what your role is as an international responder or international department into this mix of a very campus-based document. And slowly over time, you'll be able to help each other out. There's some advantages to that we'll talk about later, of course. But during the incident, it's having the ability to work together and identify that capability. A police chief or the student housing director, it may not be the right person to be the incident commander for an international event. But having the student health or student housing director on the response team could be very important when you have a facility that's housing 30, 40, 50, maybe even 150 students overseas, have a house fire or a building fire that needs to be evacuated. That person can really help with understanding what housing needs, especially if there's a disability person involved or a disability case, what are the requirements and everything else, and can take that and just change the zip code or location of the address and help support it. But they would not necessarily be in charge. Again, it goes back to what is the role? This document being signed by the president and the annex being validated by the president through the CEMP process helps you make sure for 2 things that I see that are important. One is the business continuity side of the academic institution. People come and go, things change. But the second time of that is international incidents might not happen that often. And so therefore you might not have an international incident that's significant in 5 years. Your institution may have never had one, but it could. Or your institution could be very unfortunate and have 6 or 7 of them in a row, and therefore just getting very comfortable in responding to an incident. So having that capability is important. And then at the same time, one of the roles is how do you expend emergency funds? The CEMP can identify emergency funds processes, but I put that in there because that's something that's important is who has access to those emergency funds. As a camp, in my role at the University of Washington, I had a credit card for international emergencies. It had no restrictions on it, and I could spend a very, very large amount of money onto it, but I didn't have to go through 15 steps to get it. I already had it before the incident happened, so that if I needed it at 4 o'clock in the morning, I could put down a Visa card and pay for what's needed in those steps. That's an important capability. So as I mentioned back that we talk about decision authority, you know, this decision authority is important, and it becomes a challenge. Unfortunately, we have egos and we have personalities sometimes that don't get along. And again, the CEMP helps us advance those things before the incident happens. Someone just might be having a bad day, and it just interrupts the workflow of how to deal with the response. And working through that challenge is better to do it in advance than it is during the incident. What's really nice about this opportunity is it brings us together before an incident. So when we have an incident take place, we already know each other. We already understand the complexities and the challenges that we face, or the complexities of our job descriptions and that functionality, so we can move forward. And what I found to be helpful in reducing the number of steps with our senior officials is identifying this in the same process, so that the president and the provost understands that the policy is going to advise them what they should do. There's going to be an operational plan. This is what we're going to do. Do we have permission to move forward on this? Do you agree to this step? Instead of saying, hey, on a campus-based emergency, you're going to get the information this way, versus an international emergency, you're going to get the information this way and these different steps. They're very busy people. They're very complex, and they have challenging schedules, and they have very little time, unfortunately, to support all of that. So let's make sure that we can make the decision authority process is very easy to do for them, so it can handle the dynamic challenges it is for us and work together. Sorry, Steve, I have one more slide before 16. All right. So policy considerations, things to think about. I talked about, again, about how do you remove a student from a program, or how do you remove a faculty member? What are the challenges that are there? And there's opportunities for us to do things. There's a handful. I mean, there's probably a dump truck full of examples that we could use for international incidences, even though we've never had one. And the simple way of doing that is take any after-action report from your campus that you've had and change the location address to somewhere in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in New Zealand, in South America, anywhere you want. Maybe not North Pole, South Pole, but anywhere else. You can take that incident, put it there, and create an international incident for you to work through for training and exercises and discuss about policy issues. Because anything that can happen on campus, I can guarantee you either has or will happen overseas with a student or a faculty member or an employee of your university. And so this is where you can start helping identify the risk tolerances and be able to put those into policy, identify how to handle those, or if you're even going to allow your institution to be in those types of situations. Again, that's a very institutional-based decision. It takes a lot of work, and that's where that oversight committee will help you work through those challenges. But as you identify those, that will help reduce or increase your risk and what you need to do for responses to those challenges. As an example, evacuating post an earthquake. I mentioned this a little bit earlier about Ebola, but it could happen to earthquakes as well. You have an earthquake in a country, you're trying to get students out, but you have your department that focuses on earthquakes. Like for example, in Seattle, we have the Pacific Northwest Seismic Group Network, and they want to do research because they're advancing forward greatly in some phenomenal earthquake research, but they need to be on site. So you have two challenges there. One, how do you get people over? And then how do you authorize and approve someone to go over to the places where there's possible future injury and future earthquakes? So those type of policy decisions and challenges that you might face. And crisis communications, kind of talking a little bit more about that and how it works inside of your CEMP and then an Annex is, you know, campus communications is really there to focus on branding and focusing on maintaining that brand and enhancing that brand further. They're also there to help squash rumors and make sure that things look shiny and pretty. And I say that politely, but that's really their major focus. So it's important to make sure you help them understand the type of information that you're looking for, and they're monitoring a lot of social media, which is a huge challenge in itself. So help them monitor what you need so that you don't have to then spend all this time monitoring it yourself as much. And so how do you make them help you and you help them is by working together and identifying possible issues. And how do you support that process by working together? You talk, you identify possible solutions, you identify issues that could be a challenge, you walk through and you go through scenarios such as a very simple thing, and I fear this at University of Washington all the time. I used to get thousands of text alerts when I was at the university, searching breaking news, searching, I put in there in the slide U, but it's a UW or whatever your institution is, the OMG, local news, your CNN, and going, here's a picture, our bus just rolled over, here's a picture, and it says you see someone wearing a UW sweatshirt or whatever your institution sweatshirt, and it's breaking news, and someone grabs it, and then it just goes viral on you. How do you work through those challenges to make sure that crisis communications doesn't just respond to it, but they're communicating with you and going, are there any concerns? If that bus accident happened in Egypt, or if it was a political event in Egypt, it would be a much different response than if it were happening in another country that was much easier and no political strife. So working together and challenging each other on developing plans and adding international activity into the mix will help reduce some of those challenges when that no-notice event happens. That's very tragic and very challenging. Steve, I think we're going to a question.
Yep. A fascinating one from Gene Young. How long do you owe a duty to handle an international situation involving a student? I'm thinking of the Amanda Knox situation in Italy.
Ooh, you brought one close to home there. Amanda Knox situation, I was not there during that time when that happened, but my physician started becoming a concern, like we should have someone that does this because of this case. And from the knowledge that I have of the Amanda Knox cases, we started supporting it at the beginning and then started transitioning away from it because certain cases, at certain point, they'd agreed that we are no longer responsible for this and we cannot handle it. But unfortunately, what we did have to do at the university was maintain a crisis communication part to it because the University of Washington was on top of the fold of the New York Times for almost 30 days straight because it mentioned Amanda Knox, University of Washington student, but she was no longer a student. And so there was a definition point, but it still kept on bringing up UW. And whenever, most of the time you mention Amanda Knox still, it still shows up as the University of Washington student. Some agencies are now saying just student. And that's something that your oversight committee and your attorneys will have to define. But that's something that's important to make sure to define. And Amanda Knox is kind of a very unique case because it involves something that hopefully doesn't happen that often. But it's a great question that you ask is, let's say for a student that has a disability from an accident and needs 3 or 4 weeks to recover before they can actually be evacuated home on a special aircraft. How do you support? Do you support that student for the 3 weeks, or do you find that student no longer being students and they're on their own, they're on their medical insurance and they've withdrawn from academics because they can't go to class? Those are decisions that you're going to have to make that I think are more challenging and are much more possible for you to deal with on the longevity of incidences and supporting students or faculty overseas during long-term events. Great question.
In light of the earlier question about Clery, is there a reason that public safety is not part of the policy group?
Well, so that's actually a good point, and maybe I made a mistake on that, but not defining it. At the University of Washington, the director of student life, so the vice president of student life, is the police department reports to that person. So by direct reporting, they were involved because the vice president of student life is in charge of the police department. So if that's not the case in your institution, yes, public safety should be involved. It should be a very high level, the chief or deputy chief, to be a part of that. I have a great working relationship with the chief and the deputy chief and a lot of the police officers and dispatchers because they answered our 24-hour duty phone as a resource, and so I didn't have to necessarily do it as much. But that's a great question on making sure that your public safety is involved. One thing I do mention, though, be careful in saying, and I mention it later as well, but I may not now, is, I'm talking about it now, is remember that law enforcement doesn't necessarily need to always be in charge, especially if it's a law enforcement event that happens overseas. They have no legal authority overseas, but they are a great organization to partner with because they have official law enforcement channels through the FBI, Interpol and things like that they can go to get information and help. But it's important to make sure you recognize that even the campus-based emergency manager may not be in charge, or the incident commander of this event, because it's happening overseas. That might be the international officer or the international travel health and safety person, that full-time person, because they have more experience and knowledge of that incident. But the law enforcement is a great partner to have there with you because they can help break down some barriers, but they may not have the understanding or the experience on dealing with international incidences.
Final question during this break, but keep those questions coming, and Pascal has agreed to provide answers to anything we can't get to during the hour. Don't many of these things apply to domestic travel as well? University members could easily be caught up in an incident like Paris domestically.
That's a great question, and I was I had some slides about that, and I had to, minimize. I could talk for about 5-6 hours, and some of you, my friends, know that and are probably laughing and saying, yes, he could. But that's a great example, and that was a challenge that we started identifying at the university is, our campus emergency manager, who happens to be on the phone with us, listening in, was in charge of campuses, and it was identified. And I was in charge of international. But what about the students that had to fly through New York City to get to their international destination, and they spent a day in New York City and had an accident? What about for programs that are trying to still go do study abroad, but they're not calling it study abroad, they're calling it study away, where it's programs that are based in the United States, they're traveling, but they're still studying together and they're off-site. Those are policies you need to identify and work through because you could have that same challenge. Now, one thing I would say is normally for international programs, I'm pretty sure all of you have requirements for international insurance, but study away programs, international insurance doesn't work within the United States. And at the same time, one of the other things that's a good thing about accidents that do happen in the United States is we know that the medical system is fairly well in place in most areas. We know that there's communications and resources and interconnectivity and medical records exchanging. And so there's a capability of getting people quickly to a location to support. But that's a great question on something for you to think about and add to. But for me, I was very careful on trying not to add myself to more roles and responsibilities about the university for dealing with domestic-based issues as well. But it was starting to become more of an issue that are going to have to work through.
Okay, home stretch.
Great, thanks. No, that was some great questions. So, as we talk about the CEMP and emergency management, I'm going to kind of go into the phases of emergency management. For some of you who are familiar with the incident command system and emergency management, you understand that there's the mitigation, the preparedness, the planning, the response, the recovery phases. And I want to go through some of those a little bit in that kind of terminology to help us understand, to help focus for those who are not part of the international things, who are really focused on emergency management and need that help to kind of move forward. But at the same time, there's some great things in here for you to have. So some mitigating efforts that are really important that should be documented in the CEMP just to help people identify and understand what's happening and what measures there are in play is to include inside international incidences 2 things. 1, international travel insurance, which I quickly mentioned. This should be a requirement across the board, either way of the university just pays for it or it bills back the insurance or they do a verification process, but there should be a way to make sure that all travelers of a university are covered under international travel insurance. There are different ratios, different levels. There's some things called international travel assistance, international travel insurance, and I'm happy to help define that a little bit more in a sub-question afterwards. But some important things to making sure that there's international evacuation for both political and medical issues and natural disaster issues, that there's resources available for events of unfortunate accidents or happenings, that there's some legal coverage. There's all kinds of things inside international travel insurance. It's a whole other discussion, and it could be a whole other webinar, but that's something to make sure that you have in there. If you have that, once you have that, make sure that's identified in the CEMP so people know how to get a hold of it, what it does for provide provisions and things like that. Another one is an area that's growing tremendously, and I'm actually working on some technology to help build this because I identified that there's some challenges with this. And I mean, how many of you always have a challenge of trying to deal with your travel itineraries and everything else? Is a travel registry. Anybody leaving somewhere overseas or even domestic in that the question we just had, there should be a travel registry for them to register so you know where they're at. This can become very big brother-ish, which is a very big challenge to deal with, but at the same time, as an institution, you're an organization, you're responsible for these travelers. They're traveling on their business, Therefore, they should be under a travel registry, and there's some ways of doing that. But you can set one up if you need to now quickly by just going to a Google form and putting in name, phone number, emergency contacts, destination, dates, time, some very simple things, just so you have an idea of going, wow, I have a person going to this country. Okay. So when 3 days later you hear about a big bombing going off, you have an idea that, wait, there was someone in that country. Let's go find them and reach out to them. At least start with something and move forward, but hopefully we'll have some better tools. A lot of the international travel providers for insurance also have registries built in and different requirements, and some study abroad office tools also do the same, but how do we unify all of them together for all the diverse travelers? Big challenge. So we're trying to work on some solutions for that. But these are two things that are huge for mitigation efforts. Other things, oops, sorry, I forgot to advance my slide. I'll let that sit up there for a second. But those are things that we can start doing in mitigating. But when we move forward to preparedness, well, that's something that's important to do too. In preparedness, there's two different types of preparedness, and I'll probably move this slide forward. One, there's the preparing the traveler. Pre-travel check, making sure they have their passport. Just so you know, something that's very important, and I've had plenty of faculty members and supervisors and others have this problem, is you need to make sure your passport doesn't expire for 6 months after the return date of your destination. So if you're planning on going to Kenya and your passport expires at the end of June, they still have the ability to deny you entry because your passport should expire 6 months after your last date in that country. I've had a couple different cases where I've been called from the airport in the country which they're going to, saying my passport's expired, I didn't realize it, what do I need to do, what can you do? And I said, well, you're going to have to apply for it, you're going to be canceling your flight. And that's something important. That's pre-travel preparedness. That's a whole other area of capabilities. What I want to talk about is pre-travel for the institution. What can the institution do to prepare for emergencies? Let's focus on a couple things. One, have an identified 24-hour international emergency number for people to call. And I put on here that could be travelers, but it could also be family members, someone's spouse. I've had numerous family members call saying, hey, their uncle died, or the dog died, or the house got robbed. We need to get a hold of this person. Can you help us? And they called the emergency number because they knew that's the way for them to get a hold of someone that can help them. But the 24-hour emergency number needs to be available. And I mentioned earlier about the partnership with the police department. Because we have a police department on campus, they have a 24-hour dispatch, they have 911 center, there's someone always there, there's a backup, all those things. So they answered the first part of the phone and triaged it and then forwarded it on to me. So that if I were driving my motorcycle or if I was on a mountain bike ride, I didn't have to fidget with my phone, jeopardize losing an international call. Someone was sitting there waiting for that call. Then there was the duty officer, which pretty much was my role the full time until we created a duty officer rotation program. And I highly recommend making sure when you create a duty officer role, you automatically put in a rotation process. The mental stress of part of this job is huge because you're constantly worrying and looking into what's going on around the world. And as technology and social media helps us find out what's going on, you can be aware of what's going on and then try and identify that. But some other resources for a duty officer: do you have international phone dialing capability inside your EOC? Try it. I doubt you do. Something that they normally tend to always turn off. But do you have that ability? Maybe only on certain phones. Do you have the ability to purchase financially overseas? Can you spend $10,000 overseas with your credit card on plane tickets? Even though you're supposed to go through procurement and through other processes, do you have someone that has the authority to do that and then they are the duty officer role? And then the last part of preparedness is something that I wish I could provide for everyone and give more time training and exercise. It's critical. Some agencies and institutions only do it 3 or 4 times a year, sometimes less, sometimes more. It's great. But take one of those incidences after action reports, turn it into an international address, and train. Bring everyone to the EOC and run through it and identify the problems. It's okay to have problems when you're in a training and exercise. It's great to document it and just market that process and that time and then be able to work through those challenges. Because it's better to do it then when it's, again, a 3-day weekend and someone's injured on the other side. Response phases. Response is important. International incidents are just like local, like I've mentioned. Just change the location. Use the EOC as designed to do. It helps the EOC. It helps budgets. It helps people understand that those resources are there and available. It helps get your president and provost understanding that that's an important tool. Hopefully you don't have more international incidences, but if you do, it's a place to gather. It's secure, and it's less media around you to deal with it, which is huge, keeping things under the wraps. Recovery, this is something that a lot of people, even just on campus-based emergencies, have issues with, but recovery is an important thing to do. Add that into your international annex. You need to consider a traveler coming back from a traumatic event where there's students involved. We had a student that was killed in front of a couple other students during a program. There's 15, 20 students on the program who witnessed it. There's a faculty member who witnessed the time spent for multiple days in the hospital until the student died. The faculty member witnessed the parents seeing their child die. Those are emotional things that we need to challenge. Those things need to be supported during the time of incident and also during the time when students or travelers return back to campus. Major incidences, campuses could have vigils. So it's something to prepare for as well, public safety thing. PTSD for travelers, the financial accountability obviously is always something there. So make sure you have an after-action review after incidences, just like you would for campus-based incidents. Critical, important, and will help you tremendously. In closing, I love this quote from Arthur Ashe. It's a simple thing to do. There's so much we can do. There's so much things we need to do. Where do we start? To start where you are today. If you have a CMP, great. Start adding an international annex. If you have a CMP with international annex, add to it. If you don't have a CMP, start and add in the international part to it. Use what you have. Use the resources. If you don't have a travel registry tool, Google Forms is free. Use it. Just start with something, and then by that you can do what you can, and you'll start building programs. At the same time, as do what you can and use what you have. I'm a wonderful resource. I'm happy to help. Just reach out to me, and I'll let you know what I can do to help or just give you advice. This is a passion that I have. I love being an emergency manager. It's what I do, and I'm happy to help you. And if you have any questions, I'll take some questions. I think there's another set, and then also I'll answer them post the incident in the next day or two as well.
Thanks, Pascal. We've got one question so far in the chat room. The other questions that come in, we will gather and make available Pascal's answers on the website. Title IX, is this an EMP item? What do you do if you have? What do you do to have resources ready at other locations, counselors, et cetera, evacuations, et cetera? But here's the nub. What if your student was in Germany during the assaults at New Year's?
That's part of the challenge. At the University of Washington, we had a challenge with dealing with emotional support, counseling support during sexual assaults overseas, and how do you work through that? A lot of universities have on-campus resources, working with them on going, can you do this over Skype? And can you work a couple different variable hours? Or are there resources in country that the student can go to? Your international travel provider could help with that as well, because they might have resources available. The embassies have some resources, some are more limited than others, but there's some resources out there. But those are challenges that we have to start facing and start identifying ways that we can help overcome that and make them easier. But we also have to also recognize that you are in a foreign country. These are the risks that you take, and this is how much time you actually have to support that we may not be able to do. And that's where the owned universities' risk tolerance policies need to come into play, because that way they can understand what risks they're willing to take.
Thanks, Pascal. Thanks to all of our viewers and questioners from around the internet. Check the NCCPS webinars webpage for a link to the recording of today's webinar, as well as a link to our speakers' slides and answers to unanswered questions. The brief evaluation survey on today's session that I mentioned earlier should already be in your mailbox. It will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete it. Please do. We read and act on your comments. In addition to our Campus Public Safety online webinars, the National Center for Campus Public Safety lists a wide range of other events and resources. In particular, we're currently accepting applications from colleges and universities to host our groundbreaking Trauma-Informed Sexual Assault Investigation and Adjudication educational program. We're seeking applications from all regions of the United States and from all sizes and types of institutions of higher education. We expect a large volume of applicants, so please apply by March 11th, 2016 to be considered. For more information, click the link on your screen or click the Training and Technical Assistance link on the NCCPS webpage. Campus Public Safety Online is brought to you by the National Center for Campus Public Safety with support from the University of Vermont Continuing and Distance Education and the U.S. Department of Justice. Special thanks today to Dwight DeCoster. This is Steve Worona. See you next time on Campus Public Safety Online.